Did you not look both ways? Did you not?
Hi everyone, welcome back to Music is My Mantra, the place where we discuss all things music and wellness. Today is the third week of May, so I'll be talking all about mental health through my songs and especially my song Save Yourself. I just released an EP on May 1st, and that includes Save Yourself, Galaxies Collide, and CSR, which you may or may not be familiar with because they are re-releases. However, the first two songs were not online for the past 2 years because of a distributor that I use that went out of business. So I'm super excited to have those songs back online. And also, now that it's been 4 years since I initially recorded and released those songs, I've had a lot of transformation time of my own to reflect and to grow. And so it's really actually pretty awesome to be sharing all about these songs with you from this more wise perspective. If you haven't had a chance to listen to last week's episode, I got to sit down with Courtney and we talked about her new song, Jealous of the Birds. Definitely go give that a listen. And if you're finding these podcasts helpful, please take a second to subscribe to my channel if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast on any of the streaming podcast platforms, please go ahead and review this podcast. Hopefully you've taken away something helpful. I've been really enjoying doing this since the very first week of January, and we're going to keep going. So with that, let's dive into Save Yourself. Save Yourself is a song that was inspired by my dad. And if you've listened since the very beginning, you know my entire story with my dad and his struggles with alcoholism. But if you haven't, I'll just give you a little bit of a recap. So let's go back to New Year's Eve, 2018. And at this point, I had been sober for 2 years. So 2016, I was 28 years old, and I got the news that my dad and my stepmom at the time were getting divorced. They had been together for 13 years or so, and I really felt like she was sort of his saving grace. Like he needed that inspiration to continue to be pushing through work and that sort of thing. However, I also saw it from a different perspective where the communication that I had with him had been becoming less and less, and I really had just been keeping in touch mostly with her. We were good friends, my stepmom and I. So when I heard this news, I was pretty sad because I just knew it was not good. Around that time in my life, I started going to Al-Anon meetings, which is basically like Alcoholics Anonymous for family members and friends and loved ones who are affected by somebody in their life with alcoholism. Now, if you've never heard of this program before, it's probably because it is also anonymous and you're not supposed to talk about what other people are sharing in the meetings. However, I can talk about my own experience. And for me, sharing about my dad was something that I have never really had done before. So it was really hard to go and talk about it because there was so much to unpack. I remember in high school, whenever I had issues come up with my mom or my attitude, my behavior, she would always tell me, well, okay, let's go to an Al-Anon meeting. And I thought that that was the worst thing in the world. I would always throw a fit and get my act together, so to say, so that I could avoid going to these meetings. Because in my mind, when I was in high school and experiencing all of these deep emotional games, if you will, between my parents, I didn't know what to do. I felt completely out of control, but I really just was able to sort of push that down and focus on school and put more pressure on myself to be perfect, to be an overachiever, to just appear like everything was great. And obviously, that's not a very healthy way of coping, but this is what I had to work with. And it wasn't until college, like I shared in the first episode of this month, that I really had this wild breakdown with my health and headaches. And so I was really searching and speaking with counselors and working with a hypnotherapist to sort of unpack and process everything that I was going through. So I graduated college. It was 2009, 2010. I went to go live on my own. And 8 years later is when I wrote the song. So you can imagine all of the different life experience that I had within those 8 years. And I really had a lot of ups and downs, but I was starting to figure it out. I was still hustling in New York City. I had multiple jobs. Instead of Adderall, started using, workout caffeine pills or something like that to keep me up. Or I would drink wine before I went to go work my second shift of the day or my third job or something like that. None of those are really healthy coping mechanisms, but I was in my 20s and I appeared to be keeping it together. So what I learned between college and 28 years old was that essentially 8 years, I really didn't like alcohol. I would use it when I was stressed. I would go out to, decompress, unwind. And I stopped drinking, like binge drinking, after college, but I would still drink a lot. I did live in New York City. There was, lots of events happening all of the time. As a female, you're always getting free drinks. And I hosted parties. I worked in the restaurant industry. There was drinking at work. We had to taste the wine and the cocktails and everything before we served them to make sure that the wine hadn't gone bad, for example. It was very much a part of my life still in my early 20s, even though I wouldn't go out necessarily in the same way that I did in college. I was still drinking quite a bit. And so I would go on these breaks. I would take a break for a week, a month at a time. And I started realizing that when I would stop drinking alcohol, I was still feeling that emotional wave that I would get after I had been drinking. Like the emotions, even if I stopped drinking for a week, for example, and I would have one beer, and that would just bring me down a little bit emotionally, and the emotional heaviness that came from that really just would make me spiral, and it was hard to pull out of that. And so it was a combination of that self-searching that was instilled within me, probably from my mom, bless her. Also, I had a mentor at the time who I didn't know was sober. However, when I told him that I was taking a break, like a month break from drinking, he was like, it's probably just better if you stop altogether. So I thought about it and I was like, all right, let's just see how long I can go without alcohol. Flash forward to 2018, I'm sober for 2 years, and I hear that my dad and my stepmom at the time were getting divorced. And it definitely brought up a lot of stuff. Like, I was worried for him. I just felt like I didn't know what was going to happen, but I didn't really have a relationship with him anymore. The last time that I saw him, he was living in Nashville, and we were all partying, but it was just not very good. He had said some things that were really hurtful, and he thought he was being funny, but humor can be really cutting. And when you're drinking, you might think you're really funny, but you don't really understand what you're saying, potentially. Or maybe he did mean to hurt me, or he thought he was playing, but it just wasn't fun. And so I was really concerned with the guidance of going to these Al-Anon meetings and, like the first meeting I went to, I could barely even get words out. I thought that I'd be able to say why I was upset, and I just was crying the entire meeting. And I kept going to these meetings through 2020, even when I moved out to California. And, it wasn't necessarily like I was super involved. I never got a sponsor. I never got as involved as I could have. But just going to the meetings and being a part of them and even just sitting in was so cathartic, knowing that I wasn't the only one who was experiencing something tragic or terrible from people that they loved. You know, it oftentimes feels like we're put into these situations and we have no control over it. And Al-Anon gave me the space to create a healthy boundary for my dad and myself. And so I had written him this letter. It basically said, in a very encouraging way, I'm looking forward to having a relationship with you when you get sober. And around Christmas time, he called me and he was like, you can't possibly imagine me to get sober. I'm this old. He had all these excuses and stuff. And I said, no, I'm serious. And that was the last we talked. It brought up a whole other set of emotions when he passed in 2021. I had no idea that could happen. I really thought, I still believed that he could get better, but he didn't want to. This was definitely on my mind when I wrote the song, Save Yourself. There is a line specifically in the chorus that says, I'm not the only one who feels you falling down. And this is specifically to him falling. He was a professional football player in college, and since then, he would get painkillers for his back. And so sometimes he would drink and he would mix the painkillers with alcohol. And my stepmom would tell me about these stories about how he would fall down the stairs. And I even witnessed it at one point. I was in middle school, I think, when he took my sister and I to Disneyland, and we had been hanging out by the pool all day, but he promised that we could go back into the park to see the fireworks at night. And so we somehow got him on the train and the tram from the hotel to go back into the park. And as we are there waiting for the fireworks to come on, he is like falling all over the place. Like, my sister and I are small. My dad was a big guy. He was a football player. And I don't remember how we made it home, but I just remember that he couldn't stand up. And it was so scary and so disheartening. But, you know, at the time it was just like we were trying to survive. Like, he would always just make jokes and sort of brush things off. And so we never talked about it. It was just a core memory that I have of him being completely like blackout drunk at Disneyland. And my sister and I are not even driving age, somehow taking care of him. There's a lot that I could say about alcoholism and his experience, or my experience witnessing him and his downfall. But I do think that mixing the alcohol with the painkillers just made the entire process go quicker, because the more times that he would fall, I can only imagine how many small concussions that he actually had when he was, you know, blacked out drunk, sleeping on the couch, or who knows. He didn't really know, he didn't have boundaries. He just didn't want to feel anything. And I can't speak for him, but that's my best guess. In writing this song, I wasn't really thinking so much about how music would heal me or the vibration of the song would contribute towards me becoming a stronger person. I just was focused on telling the story and sharing my experience. And, you know, even in the beginning, the first verse, every time it's still the same, can't find the drugs, complain. I remember being a kid, my dad was addicted to chewing tobacco, and I just knew that it wasn't good for him. There was, you know, a bunch of like anti-smoking campaigns. You don't even really see that these days because people just know that smoking isn't good for you. So I used to think that I was doing him a favor by hiding his tobacco, his Copenhagen chewing tobacco. He would do way more than just complain. He would yell and I would get spankings, which I don't really believe in, especially as a teenager. Let's just say that. And you know, he was not an angry drunk. He was probably one of the happiest go luckiest guys that, you know, he was always the life of the party. But after time and reflection and talking through these things and really learning about the disease, it's like all of these things are signs of alcoholism. Alcohol, let's just say, alcohol makes you very myopic. And so if you're constantly drinking day in and day out to escape something, you never have the ability to come back to reality and get grounded and actually see a situation for what it is. And he never wanted to take responsibility for where he was at. He would not even admit that he had a problem. He would say, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm a drunk. There's a difference. And we would laugh and move on. But the difference is that I guess if you admit that you're an alcoholic, then you have a problem, whereas a drunk, you're just drunk. There is no difference. If you're a drunk, you're an alcoholic. And if you're an alcoholic, you can't stop. I guess if you're drunk, maybe you could stop. I'll never understand that. But the point is that alcohol is a very dangerous drug, and it's so commonly accepted in society that I just want to talk about this so that you and people in your family can, or anybody that you know, perhaps can also become more educated and make a decision before it's too late. Because if you don't think that you have a problem, but you're constantly finding yourself in drama, or in my dad's case, for example, he moved all around the country trying to keep a job, and he couldn't keep one because he would just slip up. And if you can't keep it together, you have a problem. And if you can't admit that, that's an even bigger problem. My heart goes out to people who have been through something like this. And if you have a history of alcoholism in your family, it's especially important for you to stay alert, stay present, stay aware of how you're using alcohol, of when you're using alcohol. Now, for example, if you find that like you need to use alcohol to become more social, then it's a coping mechanism. If you can't enjoy yourself without alcohol, then you have a problem. If you turn to alcohol to avoid negative feelings, you have a problem. If you use alcohol to cope with depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues, it's not helping. I hope that my story about my dad can inspire you to take a look at yourself and really admit that you're in dangerous water, because the problem only gets worse with alcohol. If you have these pre-existing conditions, if you are anxious, depressed, sad, deeply emotional, like I have been, the answer is not alcohol. The answer is therapy, it's being creative, it's songwriting, music, knitting, sports, hypnotherapy, talking to somebody. There's just so many different ways that you can get help these days. And if it's an insurance thing, you can try betterhealth.com. They have lots of different people that you can talk to that are certified, that are trained. This episode is not meant to be a solution to solve your problems. The song that I wrote is called Save Yourself, because at the end of the day, you're the only one that can change your life. Nobody is going to do it for you, and nobody is going to save you. Now, if you start going into a program like the 12-step program, like Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the first things that you'll learn is that we are powerless, that there's a higher power, that there's a God out there. And surrendering to God is one of the first steps in admitting that you have a problem and working towards a better life. Save Yourself is really just about surrendering. It's about admitting that you might need help, and it's okay that you need help. But you're the only person that can recognize if you are turning to alcohol when you're super emotional, or if you're using it in any circumstance other than celebratory. It sounds, you might be listening to this and thinking like, wow, every person that I know uses it when we're depressed and we're trying to decompress after work. It's like, that is a problem. And it's not you and it's not your peers. It's the culture. It's the cultural problem that we do that, you know? And using alcohol in a ceremony or like a wedding ceremony or something like that can be really beautiful. But those ceremonies are also, there's a lot of preparation that goes into it. There's a lot of intention. The problem is that when we're reacting without intention and we get into these myopic spins of thoughts, it just makes everything spiral. And usually that's not a good spiral. The term alcoholism is not used so much today. It's really more, they typically say alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence. According to the American Psychiatric Association, alcohol use disorder is both a medical and a mental health condition. I want to point this out because it's defined as not a moral issue, but it's the only condition or disease that actually can be prevented by simply not drinking. If you don't use alcohol, you will not become alcohol dependent. You will not abuse alcohol. If you think about every other disease out there, especially the mental health ones, they're very nuanced. They can be affected by the situations that we find ourselves in. And in one way, alcohol abuse can be perpetuated by that. However, you also have the power to save yourself and just say no. And there's so much power in saying no. If you think about all the different decisions and pressures of the world, why add one more element of danger and potential disease when you could just completely avoid it altogether? I hope this episode has been more inspirational than sad and depressing, but I just feel like there's so many ways to process your emotions and to get help. And I just want to reiterate that you're not alone. If you are struggling with alcohol, or if you have a loved one who is struggling with alcohol and it's affecting you, you're not alone. And personally, Al-Anon helped me a ton, and they have meetings every single day of the week, morning, noon, and night. You just have to Google it and you'll find a meeting that you can probably get to. I highly encourage you to seek help. And even if you don't think you have a problem, I just know that there's so much more life out there than numbing your feelings and putting things off to another day. Each line of that song has like a very specific memory or experience tied to it. And even in the end where it says, never been accused before, never been wrong, you say, well, the last thing I'll say about alcohol abuse is that it can be very confusing because you may not know, let's say that your dad or your partner has been drinking. You may not know how much they've been drinking or how bad the problem is. And so there are days where they're drinking all day and they seem completely normal and you have the best time of your life. And then there may be another day where it starts out the same and then one thing switches and then all of a sudden this person is just lying to your face. And someone that you trust, that you love, so suddenly you might start believing them. And you probably want to believe them because if it's somebody that you love and that you trust, typically we want to be able to think that we can rely on these people. And especially when things get bad is when it gets harder and harder to step away because it almost just becomes like an unconscious manipulative cycle. I feel really lucky that my dad was never manipulative in the way of like, towards me anyway, asking for money or being physically manipulative or abusive or anything like that. But I've experienced relationships or even just dating people that I didn't know were alcoholics until I knew, and that I've had to see through the lies. And, it's really a scary thing when you're giving somebody the benefit of the doubt and it's a vulnerable space when you're getting to know somebody. I guess this is just also a message for all of the people out there that don't drink and you want to just be moving along in your life. But, maybe you grew up with some instability and alcohol abuse. I would highly recommend that you also get help for this, because patterns tend to cycle through in our lives. The codependent relationship that's created when you are living with an alcoholic is a really tough and tricky one. So that's all I'll say about that. My next episode is going to be all about codependent relationships, which is also what my song Galaxies Collide is about. So stay tuned for next week where I dive into that song. And in the meantime, I hope that you find some hope in this episode today. Even if the subject matter was maybe not exactly what you expected, I just pray that you got some nuggets of information that might be helpful. As I said, I'm not a mental health therapist. I can just only speak from my own experience. However, I do encourage you to save yourself, to strive for something better, to experiment in your life with abstinence from alcohol or substances or toxic people. It's the best thing that you can do in your life is really just to try to understand yourself. This takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work and energy, but by the grace of God, you can change your life if you want to. You can become happy and free, and it just starts with that decision that I'm going to get better. I want more for myself. I want to be happy. I want to understand myself more. You can save yourself, but it has to start with you. So on that note, thank you for tuning in today. I'll see you next week where I continue on this mini mental health series. And until then, hope you stay healthy, wealthy, and wise. Bye.